So over the past several weeks, we've been trying to walk this path of what we're calling descent. Now, we have said that Christianity should not be fundamentally about ascent, although I think we think it should be, but it shouldn't. It shouldn't be about climbing. It shouldn't be about achieving. It shouldn't be about improving our way into God's good favor. It should be about descent, about honesty, surrender, about trusting that grace meets us not at the top of our strength, but at the bottom of our need. And today, Paul gives us incredible metaphors to help us wrap our minds around it. And the clearest image yet, I think he gives us for what this descent path looks like is baptism. If you want to understand the Christian life, Paul says, just watch what happens in the water. He begins with a question in verse 1. Should we continue in sin in order that grace may increase? It's a bit of a logical question. I mean, if grace abounds wherever sin increases, then wouldn't we just be showing others how great God is by us keep sinning? I mean, think about it. Why not just treat sin like a safety net? It'll be great. Or grace like a safety net. Why not just expand the reach between God's grace and all of our sin? Should I continue in sin so grace may abound? Paul answers that in verse 2. No. By no means. And then here's his explanation. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Now look closely at that. How can we who died? Paul's talking about death. And then look what he says in verse 3. Do you not know that all of us who were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Baptism for Paul is not just a religious ceremony that we perform to show that we belong to a congregation. It's not just a spiritual graduation. It's definitely not a gold star that God gives us for good behavior. For Paul, baptism is a burial. When someone goes under the water, they descend. They disappear underneath the surface. It's a picture of letting go. We're letting go of control or self-justification, the old identity that we built on sin and shame and striving is being let loose. Paul says in verse 4 that we are buried, therefore with him by baptism into death. I mean, Paul can't stress this enough. We are buried with Christ. And this is another way that I think we should see this path of descent, that we are buried with Christ. Now, I know that sounds dramatic, and it's supposed to, but it's also meant to be freeing, because that old self, the self in you that is addicted to the climb, to ascent, obsessed with proving your worth, the trap that we have of patterns of fear and pride, that self is not slowly polished into holiness. That self is to be crucified with Christ. Paul says this in verse 6. We know that the old self was crucified with him, so that the body of sin might be destroyed, so we might no longer be enslaved to sin. Now notice what Paul does not say. He doesn't say that the old self that we're trying to get rid of should be negotiated with. He doesn't say that old self needs to be managed. He doesn't say the old self needs to be disciplined into submission. Just try harder, you'll get it. He says the old self should be crucified. The path of descent means we stop trying to rescue the old self. We have to let it die. Several years ago, I helped a man clean out his late father's garage. Now, his dad was one of those dads that just kept everything. Broken lawnmowers, rusted tools, cracked chairs, boxes of tangled cords whose purposes were long forgotten. Every item in that garage carried a story, no doubt. Every pile was sentimental. But as we began sorting through the piles, my friend realized something. He wasn't preserving his father's memories. He was preserving decay. The garage was so full of broken things, there was no room to put anything that was still living. At one point, he picked up an old push mower that it hadn't worked in literally 20 years. And I remember he said to me, I kept thinking, maybe I could fix it. Maybe I could salvage it. It felt wrong to just throw it away. But the more that he tried to repair it, the clearer it became. That lawnmower was beyond repair. Keeping it wasn't honoring his father. It was just him clinging to what no longer had life in it. So he made a decision. He let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because holding on to it was keeping him stuck. Sometimes the old self is a lot like that garage. We hold on to patterns, defenses, identities, habits, even sins, because they feel so familiar. They once protected us. They're sentimental. At one time in our life, they made sense to live out of those patterns and defenses and identities and habits. And part of us believe that if we just spend a little more time on it, we can rehabilitate those habits. We can polish them off. We can even tame them. But remember, Paul doesn't say that the old self needs to be renovated. He says it needs to be crucified. The path of descent means we stop trying to rescue what's already dead. We trust that by letting go, that thing is not lost. We're instead making room for it to resurrect. You really need to wrestle with this because I want to say it slowly. It'll be on the screen. We must stop trying to rescue what is already dead. We trust that letting go is not loss. It's making room for resurrection. And honestly, this is why Lent feels so uncomfortable, because it invites us into those baptismal waters, into the burial first, into naming the patterns that we cling to. All of that control and ego and resentment and compulsions, the old self, the false self, the dying self, and trusting that grace is strong enough to hold us as all of those things begin to loosen their grip. But here's the crucial thing. Baptism is about death, but it's not just about death. Paul says baptism is death with Christ. And wherever Christ is, death is never the end. Go back to verse 4. Therefore, we were buried with him by baptism into death. It's not a period there, it's a comma. So that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we also might walk in newness of life. Descent leads to rising. But notice the order. We don't rise in order to earn grace. We rise because grace claimed us in the descent. The baptismal waters do not simply wash us. They drown first those things that are killing us. I want to be very careful about this language because I know we're talking about drowning and death and dying and crucifying. This is dark stuff. It's meant to be. It is metaphor, but it also plays into the way we live our lives. Paul is saying, your old life needs to die. Your old life needs to be crucified, put to death in order so new life can resurrect with Christ. So when we come up out of the baptismal waters and we're dripping and we're breathless, we need to understand we are not the same. We're changed. We're different. We're new. The old life has died, and we aren't rescuing the old life. A new life has formed, and life has breathed itself into death. Now, in this new life, Paul's not saying you're never going to struggle again. He's not denying the reality of temptation or weakness. What he's saying is sin no longer has the ultimate authority. Sin is no longer your master. Once upon a time when we were living in Virginia, we went to Williamsburg and we did a tour of an old plantation home. It's now being turned into a museum, and one of our guides that we were on, it was a guided tour, he explained to us, these were his words, what emancipation actually meant for that community, for especially the enslaved people in those first confusing months after freedom was declared. Now, legally, they were free. The law had changed. Their status had changed. Their identity had changed. They could walk again in new life. But many of them struggled to leave immediately. Not because they wanted to remain enslaved, but because freedom was unfamiliar. The rhythm of bondage is what they knew. The voice of the people who had power over them is what they could hear. Even after emancipation, some still woke early in the morning waiting for instructions. The law had changed, but their instincts had not yet caught up to the newness of life. I think that's the same picture Paul is painting here. When he says we have died with Christ and risen with him in new life, he's saying something definitive has happened. The law has changed. Sin is no longer our legal authority. Sin no longer owns us. It no longer determines our identity. But that doesn't mean the old voices just disappear. Temptation still speaks. Habits still tug. Shame still tries to issue orders. But we don't have to listen to them anymore. Sin is no longer our master. We may hear the voice, but we are not bound to obey it. Because in Christ, emancipation has already been declared. The path of descent buries the old ownership. And though we may still feel the pull of that former way of life, we are learning slowly and maybe shakingly how to live as people who are actually free. Look at verse 5. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. What a word. What a verse. Twice we see the word united. This is covenant language, intimate, permanent language. Hopefully by now you can see that the path of descent is a road we must take to join our lives to Christ. And we must do it so completely that Christ's story becomes our story. Christ's death becomes our death. Christ's burial becomes our burial. His resurrection becomes our new life. And this is where I think the ashes of Lent become redeemed. On Ash Wednesday, we heard the words, "Remember that you are dust." It's a humbling reminder of our mortality, our limits, our fragility. But baptism says something deeper. Yes, we are made from dust, but our dust has been claimed by Christ. Our dust was buried with Christ. Our dust rises with Christ. Our ashes become redeemed when we become crucified with Him. So let me tie this together using this metaphor of baptism again. Remembering that in baptism, you go down first. You go down to let go of the old self. You are crucifying the old self. You have died to the old self so you can rise and be claimed by a love stronger than death. So when those voices of those old patterns creep in, you can say to yourself, those things are no longer my master. I've been buried with Christ, and I rise again in grace. I have been buried with Christ, and I rise again in grace.